Hi, everybody. This is Addison Shonland. It is July 22nd, 2020, and my guest today is Richard Koe, MD of WINGX, that's WINGX, a German company based in Hamburg that focuses on business aviation, although Richard tells me all fixed-wing aircraft globally is something that they track. Richard, thanks so much for spending some time with me today.
Great. Thanks for having me, Addison.
So, although you track everything with WINGX, let's focus on the business jets or the business aircraft side of the industry. Yep. It seems to me that based on a webinar we did yesterday, but also seeing some of the data that you have, business aircraft are recovering, or activities recovering much faster than commercial aviation, airlines.
Yeah. Business aviation activity dropped like a stone in the second half of March and through April. It was down some 70% globally, but in May it was down by 50%. By June it was down by 30%, and this month it is tracking at just a little above 80% of normal. So in the same period, scheduled aviation sectors have been down by 70% and more, and they're still trailing 60% this month.
When do you think business aviation comes back to 2019 levels? Do you have a guess of that?
Yeah, no, we're looking at that all the time. I think it's an absolutely critical question. I mean, there's so much at this point around that that's speculative, but you know, I would say our best estimate is that Q2 next year we're gonna we could well see normalized total activity for business aviation. That is business aviation activity that is comparable to the last 5-year average, rather than clearly the deep hole in the first half of 2020.
So the pandemic has obviously limited long-range flying. You have to fly inside a bubble, so to speak, and bubbles are not big; they're pretty much national. Have you seen changes in the deployment of airplane types because of that?
For sure. Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, we've seen a pretty steady curve between the lighter aircraft and the props, which are suffering around 10% at this point, 10% reduction on last year levels, through the larger aircraft and the mid-size down by some 20%, and the long-range large cabin aircraft still down by 30 or 40%.
And I guess those big airplanes with the long ranges are not going to be deployable until borders open, right? Particularly transcontinental borders.
Yeah, but there's also the fact that even, in normal times, pre-COVID, we saw, and over the last few years, this is quite typical, that the long-range large cabin jets are still undertaking most of the time sectors of 1.5 hours or less. So it's not necessarily the cross-border restrictions that are holding these aircraft back. I think there are other factors too. I mean, that's probably the most important one. But there are other factors such as, a larger proportion of the large cabin long-range aircraft are privately owned, as opposed to in the charter market. And I think a lot of owners have just chosen to part their aircraft in the few months since COVID came along.
That's an amazing insight that these airplanes are flying 90 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, well over half of the sectors flown by heavy jets are under 1.5 hours.
So then you would expect in a place like, let's say, Asia or even China or the US, or maybe even Australia, where you have long-range 4-hour flights, 5-hour flights to go coast to coast, you'd probably expect to see some activity, but not much, huh?
Yeah, I mean, there you've got the restrictions in force. That's what's holding stuff back, and that could develop into longer term obstacles to the recovery of those types of flights, because in the first place you've got restrictions that are simply part of the government suppression of the virus. But then what we may well see here, and we were starting to see this before the crisis came along, a change in the way global supply chains are organized. And somewhat of a retraction and domestication, a lot of that, industrial output. And as that happens, we could see, less transcontinental connection and less need for these sorts of aircraft.
Richard, when you look at the various segments across business aviation, do you guys have a sense of the segment recovery rates? You know, light jets, turboprops, mid-size. I guess you'd have a sense of different recovery rates.
Yeah, I mean, we're at a very early stage still, so somewhat speculative. But I would say in the first couple of months, where things were really locked down, a lot of the activity that remained went on to turboprops. That turboprop recovery is kind of now treading water, and we're seeing the pent-up demand mainly in small jets. We're seeing them come back to within 5 or 10% on some platforms of normal activity. Then as we go into the larger aircraft, we're seeing the super mid-size making up quite a lot of ground. To pick out aircraft like the Praetors or the Bombardier 350s, Challenger 350s, they're making up quite a lot of ground. I think the heavy and ultra long range aircraft will come back into the picture later this summer, but as I said, so far they're still trailing 30-40% behind normal.
What other interesting data trends have you guys been seeing from your sources?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most interesting part of this recovery debate is the juxtaposition of airline connectivity really being severely cut back and being very slow to recover, and business aviation somewhat stepping up to fill that gap, because I think that explains and will continue to explain the resilience in BizAv. I mean, we're seeing, for example, now a belated kind of summer season in Europe, right? We saw it around Independence Day in the US. Seeing the leisure market come back, been locked down several months. Now people want to travel, whether it's to secondary homes or popular resorts. And some of that activity is up year on year. We did a little study around Independence Day where we saw increased activity compared to 2019 around the same holiday. And now we're looking at Europe, and we're seeing, for example, Spain, which has some of the most popular resorts. We're seeing more BizAv activity than we did last year. And I think, part of that, let me take one example just to give you an illustration. Flights into Mallorca, which is, obviously a very popular resort in Spain. For the first 3 weeks of July, they're up by 20%, right? BizAv flights. And
20% on 2019?
Yeah, they're up on 2019 by 20%. Whereas scheduled activity, the number of sectors flown by commercial airlines into Mallorca, down by 60%. So, it's circumstantially quite strong evidence that people are simply seeing that BizAv is the only way they're going to get there and back comfortably and conveniently, besides the hygiene element, which is obviously very important too.
That's an interesting statistic. Of course, the market extent or size is quite different when you talk about BizAv to commercial, but obviously there's a segment that can that lives in that bracket that flies private.
I mean, a lot of I used to work on the brokerage side, the brokerage and charter side of the market, and we had, and I know this is still the case, many customers who will fly private, may even own an aircraft and fly private, maybe a charter customer and fly private, but they'll also fly a lot of commercial. Many of them used to take, EasyJet or other low-cost carrier. And that was just something that suited them because both options at different times were more convenient. Now, if that customer set chooses now exclusively to fly private, that's quite a big new market which BizAv could bring in. To give you another example, BizAv connects normal times pre-COVID 3 or 4 times the number of unique airport pairs. Okay, so despite its overall volume in normal times being some 10-12% of all fixed wing activity, it connects 3 or 4 times the number of pairs, unique pairs. In June, BizAv was connecting more than 6 times unique pairs offered by commercial aviation. So as commercial aviation has been severely reined back and BizAv has stayed more resilient, that comparable connectivity is getting better and better on BizAv. BizAv started, as I said, around 12.5% of all fixed wing activity, and it climbed at the sort of the peak of the lockdown to over 30% globally of all fixed wing sectors flown. Is now around about 25%.
When you look at the activity, you mentioned briefly about, you know, the light, first the turboprops came back, then the light jets, and now the Praetos and the Globals. Is there any sense from the data you have that can talk to us about age of airplanes? Meaning, since COVID, have older airplanes retired at the same rate as before? Because there's this huge overhang of old airplanes, particularly in the US, where we know a lot of them, I guess, clear out because they don't have ADS-B and now can no longer operate. But still, there are a lot of old jets.
Yeah.
Is this anything that you could speak to?
Yeah, we can speak to it, because what we're seeing is that we've got one category that we follow, the entry level category, which has a lot of this sort of older aircraft in it. And we're seeing that activity be much more resilient. There are a lot of those aircraft on the market. They're underutilized. They're cheap. Now, you know, we may find that they are retired over the next 6 to 12 months as this new economic reality hits, and there'll be other factors besides that, you know, especially some environmental regulation. But in the short term, these are, I think these are quite attractive options for charter customers, you know, coming into the market and needing something sort of relatively cheap. So yeah, we're seeing quite a few regions, you know, for example, the Hawker 700 series doing a lot of the heavy lifting. The Caravan's doing a tremendous amount of work. PC-12, I mean, obviously it's not that ancient, it's still in production, but it's been a mainstay of the recovery in BizAv the last few months.
It kind of, you're guiding me towards a question of what is the most active airplane that you see in the business aviation section?
PC-12, King Air 200, King Air 90, Caravan. Those are the busiest aircraft right now. Get into the business jet stable, and it's in terms of sectors flown, it's the certainly when I last looked for July, it was the Challenger 350.
That's interesting. And is this the pattern you're seeing? Is that global or is that geographic specific?
No, it's pretty similar. Certainly pretty similar Europe and North America. There are differences in other regions because you got quite a lot. You got a different mix of aircraft available.
Right. Anything you can share with us about China?
Yeah, I mean, China is. I can tell you that for the first 3 weeks of July, business aviation activity in China is down by 16%. Now, a lot of the 16. So you know, and it came. Obviously, the big hit was in February. It was way earlier. So in February, we saw BizAv traffic in China plummet, and we saw somewhat of a comeback through April and May. More domestic than international. The international element has still almost completely disappeared. But yeah, so you've seen BizAv come back to within 20% of normal. The question is, it's, you know, as in many other regions, at what point does it hit a sort of invisible ceiling, at which point it treads water?
Right. And Richard, when you look at, you know, you've mentioned that Mallorca had a lot of traffic, and that typically you would associate with vacationing people, wealthy people. Business jets owned by corporations, any patterns that you've noticed there? Corporate flying? Yeah,
corporate, and we tend to put these in the same category, but corporate flight departments and purely sort of, you know, private flight departments. That activity is quite some way from coming back. It's trailing 25 to 30% this month. So you know, I suspect, I'm obviously reading between lines here, that certainly on the corporate side, there's going to be, you know, quite a lot of hesitancy and wait and see as to how this, containment policy continues to evolve and how lockdowns are lifted. And I think owners, to a large extent, have sort of moved from one residence to another. That's really been the sort of the limit of their activity. So that's possibly last to come back in terms of what we would call operator profiles, whilst the charter market has really started to come back the strongest, and we expect to see that through the summer, benefiting from leisure demand.
And Richard, just for the audience to know, you would plan to share a few slides to illustrate some of these points that we will put on our page.
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, Wings tracks daily and updates daily business aviation activity on all pairs flown everywhere. So if any of your viewers would like to come to our website, it's very simple to subscribe to that view.
Thank you so much for chatting with me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Addison. Thank you very much for your time.